Are the principles of liberalism viable in all societies? In other words, what are the pros and cons to trying to spread liberal ideas around the world? Before we answer that question, let's review some of the key aspects of liberalism. A liberal wants to live in a society that focuses on individual rights, like the right to private property. And in order to protect those rights, there needs to be rule of law, and government institutions established to guard our rights, and fair elections to allow us to participate in the governing of society. If all the countries in the world were more liberal, wouldn't that make the world a better place? Think about the countries in the world that are struggling. There are many nation states, some of them not too far away in Central America, who have corrupt governments, failing economies, and terrible conditions for minority groups. Wouldn't it be a good idea to have developed nations come in and organize a society based on the ideas of liberalism? This humanitarian focus would give all people the rights and freedoms we take for granted. We could build their economy by establishing the institutions we currently enjoy to protect private businesses, like independent courts, while also ensuring a degree of equality through social programs based on modern liberal ideas. And if we have a trade relationship with each other, wouldn't that lessen the risks of war, as we wouldn't want to go to war with important trading partners? So it's actually in our self-interest to impose liberalism on others. In fact, why don't we just go take over those corrupt states in order to ensure that all of these liberal measures aren't destroyed as soon as we leave the country? We can take a failed state and make it as successful as we are. Liberals often think of colonizing as a bad thing, but maybe it's our responsibility to take the role of an older brother or parent who knows how to do things better. Why is paternalism so bad? Well, first, just going in and telling a country what to do is not the same as citizens accepting liberal values. As we look at the development of liberal societies from ancient Greece to the French Revolution to modern day Canada, we see a pattern for what makes a liberal society successful. There needs to be an agreement among the citizens and governing bodies to protect our rights. That usually takes time, as it's a shift away from what citizens have always known. In Western society, it took us decades, you could even say centuries, to widely accept the ideas of the Enlightenment philosophers and have solid organizations to protect those ideas. And those ideas must be enshrined in a constitution with independent courts that will prevent the next government from demolishing all those efforts that were made. The United States took months to write their constitution and didn't hold an election until a year later to make sure that the needed institutions were in place. Recently, when Western nations have imposed liberalism on another country, it just ends up becoming an illiberal society. That's a society that claims to be liberal but really isn't. That's because we think of democracy as merely holding an election. But if the citizens lack the habits, norms, and institutions necessary to make popular rule work, those elections are going to be held too soon. While elections are important to democracy, they're just one piece of the puzzle. And quite frankly, having one piece of the puzzle kind of sucks. Liberal societies must be willing to be patient and slowly introduce liberal ideas in order to ensure they're adopted and not just imposed on a group of people. A society will also need to be educated because they'll now be in charge of the political and economic decisions being made and will need to make an educated decision on who to elect as their representatives. This is going to require many people to be involved in making the decisions of what to teach and how. You want to be sure there is as many different opinions as possible to allow students to be provided with a variety of ideas to form their own opinions versus propaganda. Too often the education system can be used in an illiberal society to support the actions of a corrupt government. But you can run into problems in traditional societies who don't want their people to be exposed to new ideas, and there is merit to that opinion. In most modern liberal societies, there is a disconnect from our traditions, which can lead to a loss of community. In addition, how do you balance things like religious freedom and the rights of minority groups like the LGBTQ community when those two groups may disagree? In some traditional societies, it's inappropriate for girls to get an education, while in a modern liberal society, the right for all children to get an education is seen as essential and that women should be treated equally. Do we have the right to come into another country that's traditional and tell them they're wrong? Remember, in Canada's past, we tried to enforce what we thought was right onto the Indigenous people of Canada. Through the Indian Act and residential schools, we attempted to assimilate a traditional society in order to make them more like us. This ethnocentric and paternalistic attitude almost destroyed entire societies. If a liberal believes in freedom, then why should that liberal have the right to tell another society how they should live? Aboriginal collective thought sees the world in a different way than an individualistic society. But can we actually say that it's the wrong way? Even though that is what we used to say. And of course, to have an educated society, you need the money to pay for that education. So the society will usually need some degree of economic development. Failed states have failed economies. But how do you convince corrupt governments to give up their control over the economy without resorting to war? Quite often, liberal societies feel the need to overthrow the current regime in order to give the people the freedom we think they deserve. But a war doesn't automatically bring freedom. Instead, it brings death and destruction, and a heavy economic toll not just in that region, but also on the liberal nation-state trying to impose those freedoms. Citizens in recent conflicts where we tried to impose liberalism can be heard lamenting the loss of their dictator because at least the streetlights and the plumbing worked and crime rates were low. There can be advantages to dictatorial rule. This happened at the turn of the century in Iraq. The United States, with the coalition of other countries, overthrew the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. But during that fight with the dictator's forces, they inadvertently encouraged fighting between the Shia and Sunni Muslim groups. And all that fighting led to the massive destruction of the infrastructure and eventually the rise of radical groups like ISIS due to a corrupt government. At one point, Iraq was a failed state, due in part to Western nations imposing liberalism by trying to forcefully overthrow a dictatorship. There are so many historical and current examples of the imposition of liberalism. We're going to look at the Cold War in detail in order to evaluate the conflict created when two opposing ideologies want to impose their values on other nation states around the globe. But talk with your teacher about some current examples about the imposition of liberalism being a good or a bad idea.